As you will know, if you have anything more than a kindergartner education, the Egyptians were instrumental in forging the world that we currently live in. From the pyramids to Cleopatra, there are a ton of secrets about the ancient civilization that many people still don't know about, which might have been seen as weird. Today, we're talking about the things that used to be normal for Egyptians, but no longer are, so don't go anywhere. First up, it's the practice of sharing food. Sharing food with your family and neighbors is common practice in many different cultures around the world. So why is it so odd that the ancient Egyptians used to do it? Well, they shared their food with the dead. What? That's right. Egyptian tombs were designed with this practice in mind and allowed for family and close friends, as well as well-wishers, to leave offerings for the mummified body of the deceased, and the Ka, spirit, that also lived alongside the body. The priests would also regularly stop by, depending on the status of the buried person, whilst a hidden burial chamber would protect the mummified ones from any harm. The practice involved offering food and drink, and after it had been consumed spiritually by the Ka spirit, it would then be finished off by the living well-wishers in one of the creepier meals that we have ever heard of. There is also an annual festival known as Feast of the Valley, in which the living would spend the night with their dead relatives, feasting by torchlight. Of course, the practice no longer takes place, as modern people have presumably realized how odd this ritual actually is. What do you make of this one? Could you imagine yourself sharing meals with your dead relatives down at the local cemetery? Next up, we have women's equality. Whilst not considered weird today, Egyptian society was one of the first in the world to acknowledge the role of women within it and offer the fairer sex equal rights, which shows you just how progressive they actually were. Back then, it would have been considered extremely strange for outsiders looking in on Egyptian practices to see women afforded the same rights as men. Of course, the practice only consisted of men and women of equal social standing, so a common woman would absolutely not be afforded the same rights as an upper-class male, unfortunately. But the fact that a common man wouldn't be offered the same rights as an upper-class man either was seen as progressive in the eyes of the law. Women were allowed to own land, as well as buy and sell it with no legal ramifications, which would have been seen as completely crazy to visitors back then. They could also live alone and were allowed out in public without any male guardians, which is still taboo subject in some areas of the Middle East today, in 2022. They were also allowed to raise children as single parents and could even stand in for their husbands in legal business matters. As standard as this all is today, it would have been seen as extremely weird back in the day. Would you like to go back to ancient Egypt for a look if you could? Sounds pretty cool, to be honest. We're talking about female leaders now, so stay tuned. In another example of ancient Egypt being incredibly progressive, it turns out that females had just as much right as their male counterparts when it came to occupying the palatial residence. Ancient Egypt has a long history of queens, but in another example of flipping from progressive ideals to slightly backwards ideas of governance, modern-day Egypt probably wouldn't tolerate a female ruler, which is a shame. Way back when, there were few examples of states headed by women, but Egypt, especially in the Middle East, was seen as a bastion of progression. Of course, male heirs were preferred, like in most other places, but females could easily ascend to the throne should there be no male heir apparent. There were at least 3 occasions throughout Egypt's storied history when women took the throne and used the title king, and the most successful of these powerful women, Hatshepsut, ruled for over 2 decades. In another odd twist, these women were specifically not referred to as queen, as that term is only used for a ruler's wife, so the term king was generally accepted as a non-gender specific term, which would seem as pretty weird these days. What do you guys make of this one? Another pretty cool fact, right? The practice of incest is up next. It is known that back in ancient Egypt, a lot of Egyptian kings would actually marry their sisters to ensure that their wives were trained in the duties of the queen from the day they were born. It was also seen as a way to consolidate power by keeping it all in the family, as weird and quite frankly disgusting as the practice was. It was also seen as a way to ensure that the king's wife stayed loyal to him, and in another pretty weird practice, it was something they liked to use to provide a link to the gods. Several Egyptian gods enjoyed incestuous relationships, like Isis and Osiris, for example, and high-ranking Egyptian men saw marrying their sisters as a way to ensure that they were honoring their gods. Weird. However, the practice wasn't mandatory, and in another example of how progressive ancient Egypt was, the 2 parties would have had to agree completely before a marriage could take place. This was part of the reason why the practice died out as the state advanced. However, advancement as we know it also meant the subjugation of women and other archaic practices we now see in the region today. Unfortunate. What do you make of the practices of marrying your sister? Safely the weirdest practice we've heard so far, we would say. We're talking makeup next. Stay tuned. In what would be considered extremely weird in Egypt today, it is known that the ancient Egyptians of both sexes were fond of makeup and would apply it daily. Of course, nowadays it is generally only used by male actors, but back in the day, it was used both to look good and as a ritual. It was seen as a way to protect the eyes from the sun and to honor the sun god, Horus. The application of facial cosmetics was also a way to distinguish one's rank, and a woman with a portable cosmetics box was considered the creme de la creme when it came to status. In what would be considered extremely weird by Egyptian men today, building laborers actually went on strike during the reign of Ramses III, with some even quitting their position because their employer refused to provide them with balms and massage oils. Can you imagine that today? Pretty funny. Up next, we're talking about their deities. Of course, today, the modern Egyptian follows the religion of Islam, but in what would be seen as another pretty weird practice today, most ancient Egyptians actually believed in around 2,000 deities. Society back then had a god for everything: sex, love, weather, water, you name it. They even had a goddess of moisture moisture, known as Tefnut, and a god of embalming the dead, Anubis. Pretty weird. What's the strangest god you've ever heard of? Let us know below. Another odd burial ritual is up next, so stick around. As we know, ancient Egyptians took death extremely seriously and were known to believe in the afterlife, so burial was a big deal, and high-status Egyptians were often buried with things that their families thought would smooth the passage into the afterlife. One of the strangest and cruelest things that the Egyptians of yesteryear were buried with, which would be seen as extremely bizarre these days, was their actual servants. If a high-ranking Egyptian official happened to pass away, their servants would often be sacrificed to serve them in the afterlife. So, not only were they expected to devote their whole lives on Earth to the official, but they had to do it in the next life too. Talk about a raw deal. Pretty strange cure for bedwetting now. Stay with us. Never completely grown out of that embarrassing childhood habit of wetting the bed? Then don't worry, we've got you. Peasants back in ancient Egypt society would often go to bed with a bag of mouse bones. Yes, you heard us. Tied around their necks to cure bedwetting. We have no idea how this weird practice originated, but we would suggest it prompted more bedwetting than actually cured. Bizarre. And finally, we're talking about pets. Of course, there's nothing weird about keeping pets these days, but if we go back to ancient Egypt, some of the animals people would keep around the home would be seen as incredibly strange. Thought of as an incarnation of gods, the ancient Egyptians were known to keep baboons, lions, and hawks. Once their owners died, the pets were often killed and mummified too, to make their owners feel comfortable with the next life. What's the weirdest ancient Egyptian tradition you know of? Let us know below. As always, thanks for joining us today, and remember to stop by next time for more fun and games. Also, if you enjoyed today's video, why not like and share it, as well as subscribe to our channels if you haven't done so already. Bye guys!